Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Terrence Griffin. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at Rutgers University, Newark. Thank you all for being with us this evening. This webinar is part of the Rutgers University Alumni Association's virtual engagement series, which offers Rutgers alumni and friends the opportunity to stay connected and hear from faculty members across the university. Today, we're honored to have with us, through the storms and the downed trees, Professor Randy Mandelbaum. Professor Mandelbaum is Distinguished Clinical Professor of Law, the Anime Shepherd Scholar, and for the past 20 years, the Director of the Child Advocacy Clinic at Rutgers Law School in Newark. She has devoted her career to working with children and families. As the founding director of the Child Advocacy Clinic, she spearheads a unique clinical program which is aimed at comprehensively addressing the needs of low-income children and their families. The clinic provides representation to foster children, undocumented immigrant children, and low-income children with disabilities. As a clinical professor, each semester she supervises 8 to 12 law students who work with actual cases representing clients. And for the Child Advocacy Clinic, all of the clients are children or youth. With a colleague, Professor Mandelbaum oversees a collaborative project with the New Jersey Department of Children and Families to provide legal representation to foster children on their immigration needs. Additionally, the CAC sponsors a statewide community education project, the Aging Out Project, aimed at educating older foster youth about their rights and entitlements. Professor Mandelbaum earned her BS from Brandeis University, a JD from American University, Washington College of Law, and an LLM in advocacy from Georgetown University Law Center. Please note, all attendees will be placed on mute for the duration of this discussion. If you have questions, please send them via the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. You can send them to me directly or to all panelists. Following the discussion, we will read the questions aloud and we will get to as many questions as possible. It is now my privilege to turn it over to Professor Mandelbaum.
Thank you. Thank you. I first want to thank all of you for participating. I hope everybody fared okay in today's storm if you are in the Northeast. I also want to thank the Alumni Association for having me today. Before I begin, I really just need to preface all of my remarks with the one big disclaimer that is up on the screen. The world of immigration and immigration law is an ever-changing one. So I must caution that what I am saying today is accurate today, but really very much could change tomorrow. This is why these slides are dated and why I would not want anyone to rely on these slides or my remarks as legal advice or the last word on many of these issues. I have a pretty packed agenda for the 1 hour we're together today. I hope to get through all of what you're seeing on the screen right now. I want to begin by just talking about some background and some terminology so that we're all on the same page and that there's a clear understanding of what certain terms mean. I then hope to move into discussing how and why and also how many immigrant or migrant children and youth are in the United States, and then to drill down on New Jersey. Then we're going to very briefly just discuss some of the common immigration benefits that may be available for children, and then turn to the very latest on deferred action for childhood arrivals, otherwise known as DACA. I know there were many questions about DACA. So hopefully we will get through all of that, and then I really do plan to leave some time for questions at the end. So as you can see on this next slide, New Jersey is home to many foreign-born adults and children. Nearly a quarter of New Jersey's population of roughly 9 million are foreign-born, and this puts us in the number 3 spot for the state having the largest foreign-born population. More than half of those are naturalized U.S. citizen, and we're going to define that in just a moment. And the rest are in various, have various different immigration statuses, from lawful permanent residents to students and to immigrants that are here without papers or are undocumented. Before moving on, I always think it's important to just talk about some of the different and varying categories that exist in terms of immigration status. But I like to say that the biggest takeaway, I think, is that for foreign-born people, for immigrants, that the only true form of protection from deportation is if you are a citizen. But lawful permanent residents do carry lots of rights. So let's go through each of these. So citizens are top of the list, and they are people that were either born in this country or who naturalized or derived citizenship. People that are citizen are fully vested with rights. They can vote, they can work, they can qualify for most forms of public assistance, and citizenship cannot be taken away. Lawful permanent residents, also known as green card holders, are people who have been given permission to lawfully be in this country permanently, to work, and to enjoy most advantages of being in this country. Lawful permanent residents, green card holders, are not eligible to vote and are not eligible for some of our public assistance programs. The grant of lawful permanent resident status, which usually is typically for a 10-year period, is discretionary, which means it can be taken away by the government. The most common reason is due to certain criminal infractions or a perceived or actual threat to national security. Temporary status is just what that title means. It's permission to be in the United States, but for a temporary period of time. These temporary grants take various forms. It gives people permission to stay in this country and usually to work or to go to school. But most people with temporary status are not on paths to a green card. And the nature of temporary status is that it is time limited or it can be taken away. Common examples of temporary status are school visas, tourist visas, temporary protective status, where there's a grant to be in this country or to stay in this country because to go back, you're going back to a place where there may have been a natural disaster or there's a war. And DACA, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is also a form of temporary status. And finally, the term undocumented means someone in this country without permission from the government to be here. Some undocumented persons may be involved with removal or deportation proceedings in immigration court, where the government is seeking to deport them. Others may be here and the government is not aware that they are here. Many undocumented persons have been here for many years, many work, many actually pay taxes. Today we will be discussing primarily undocumented children and youth, and to some extent families as well, at two extremes. First, those who have recently arrived and who many of the children are often designated as unaccompanied minors or unaccompanied children, and those who have been here for many years and who are receiving or are eligible for DACA. So first, let me define, many of you may have heard the term unaccompanied alien child. I usually just say unaccompanied child or unaccompanied minor. But just to clarify who receives that designation, it's someone who, when they arrived in the US, and mostly it's at our southern border these days, they were under the age of 18. They had no lawful immigration status, and they were not, at the time they arrived, with a parent or a legal guardian. That does not mean that there may not have been a parent, there may not be a parent or a legal guardian in this country, but when they arrived alone or not, or with another child or with someone who wasn't their parent or a legal guardian. And with the designation of unaccompanied child comes certain protections under our laws, and a certain way that we, by law, are supposed to treat children who are designated as unaccompanied children. And so I wanted to just start by just, explaining what happens when a child comes to this country alone. I usually use the word is fleeing or escaping, because it's usually the situation that I see, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. And what happens to the child and how they may end up, for our purposes, let's say in New Jersey. And then we're going to drill down a little bit and talk about, the numbers of kids that are actually here and living in our communities in New Jersey. So what may happen when a child, so let's take the case of, say, a 16-year-old youth who is escaping here to avoid, both family and community violence. She only arrived here, let's say at our Texas or Arizona border with another youth. That child will be designated an unaccompanied child. Under our laws, she can only be held by the Department of Homeland Security, and at the border it will be the border police. She can only be held for up to 72 hours by the Department of Homeland Security and by the border police, when she then must, under our law, be turned over to the Department of Health and Human Services, and in particular, and this is the second box, to the second yellow box, to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. The Office of Refugee Resettlement that takes custody of unaccompanied children, and under the law, is supposed to only have children be in places that have been licensed for children. But what ORR very quickly then tries to do is, and again, this is spelled out in the law, is to release that child to a sponsor who is usually a family member. So if this 16-year-old girl has an aunt, a cousin, a grandmother, or even a parent who is in the US, for our purposes, let's say New Jersey, ORR will look to see if that family member is willing to be a sponsor and is appropriate, and will place that child with that family member, that, for our purposes, let's say an aunt or an uncle. And so then that child will be living with that aunt or uncle in whatever town you want to say in New Jersey, wherever they've been living. Now, recognize that the fact that that child was apprehended at the border by Customs and Border Patrol that child will be placed into removal proceedings. And ICE, Immigrant Customs Enforcement, will begin proceedings against that child in immigration court. But while that proceeding is going on, that child will be living with the aunt or uncle in New Jersey, has the right to go to public school, and, will be living in our communities, and availing herself of services in the community, and hopefully having the life of any child in New Jersey has. I did get a question prior to the presentation about accessing services, and in particular mental health services. That is definitely a need and a concern. Unaccompanied children are not eligible for any federal public assistance, for Medicaid. So accessing medical and mental health services is a challenge. And there certainly is a need, especially for mental health services. A lot of these children have suffered significant trauma and abuse or violence in their home country, on the journey over here, and are very much in need of mental health services. So that is sort of what happens and how a child ends up in New Jersey. Just to give you a sense of the number of children that have gone through this process. So ORR keeps track of children that are in their custody, and also keeps track of children and where and what state and even county they're placed in. So these are numbers that I'm pulling down from the government. And you can see that since 2012, and particularly since 2014, there have been thousands of unaccompanied children arriving in this country. And since 2014, over 16,000 have been placed with different family in New Jersey. Now, please recognize that these numbers only include children who have been designated as an unaccompanied child and placed with a family sponsor. They do not include children who may have fled here and were not apprehended at the border. It also does not include children who arrived with a parent or a guardian. The numbers for 2020 are low, and that is because with the pandemic, the border has essentially been shut down. Sorry, my slide. Okay. Just of interest, these are, this chart gives you some sense of where in New Jersey the children are being placed. Union County is always the highest. If a county is not on this list, it does not mean that it doesn't have any unaccompanied children, but you have to hit 50 for the government to report it. And just to have a sense of the countries that most of the children are coming from, these four countries make up about 95% of the unaccompanied children arriving in this country. Looking beyond unaccompanied children, there are many children that are also escaping to the United States with a parent or a guardian. And these numbers have been increasing exponentially until, again, very recently. Many of these families are initially detained, but under the law and a federal consent decree, children actually are not permitted to be detained in facilities that are not licensed for children for more than 20 days. The numbers are low for 2020, both because of COVID, but also because our government now has a policy where they are not allowing in families arriving here seeking asylum and are having them wait under a return to Mexico policy. So they are waiting for their turn to come up to plead their asylum case, and they're waiting in camps in Mexico. And finally, I can't talk about children and families arriving here from Central America without talking about an issue that has been going on since at least 2017 of this governmental administration of separating children, even very young children, who come to the United States with a parent. The policy, basically has the government arresting the parent who's accompanying the child for the misdemeanor crime of unlawfully entering the country. And then the parent is basically sent to jail because the child cannot be alone. The child is then treated and designated as an unaccompanied child and sent to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. This was occurring informally and then under a pilot program beginning sometime in 2017. And then in May 2018, the administration announced a policy that it turned the zero tolerance policy, where it began doing it in a huge way. And even for parents that entered the country at what's called a port of entry and requested asylum, which is a wholly lawful act. So there was nothing to arrest them for. The zero tolerance policy ended in late June when a lawsuit was filed, but not until nearly 3,000 children were separated. It took nearly a year to reunite those 3,000 children, and many couldn't be reunited because the parents had been deported before they could reunify them. The bottom line is that since 2017, over 5,500 children, and the number is probably higher, have been separated from their parents. We don't have time today to discuss the mental and physical harm that comes to children who are separated from a parent, but doctors and mental health professionals tell us that the harm can be lifelong and permanent. All right. So why, just briefly, do children and families, why are so many children and families coming? The people that study this often talk about push and pull factors, and you can see them on the screen. In many of these countries, there is extensive community violence from gangs and drug cartels. In many, there is also rampant sexual and gender-based violence. There is child abuse and neglect, and these countries don't have the systems that we have and other countries have to protect children. Extreme poverty is also very pervasive. So the push factors are very serious and very extreme. And then, some children also, a parent came to this country years ago, so the pull to want to be with a mother or a father that they haven't seen in years is huge. And many also are fleeing here because of the extreme poverty and the lack of economic and education opportunities in these countries. The journey that the children take to this country, to say that it's dangerous is an understatement. Many don't survive. It's a violent and traumatic experience for the children and for adults. The stories of why and how the children come to this country bring me to tears whenever I hear a child talk about it. In some instances, the children are near death when they arrive. Years ago, many of the children and adults were traveling on tops of trains throughout Mexico. The Mexican officials have really cracked down on that. So now many are just taking buses, walking, however they can get here. The journey can take months. And on the journey, many kids, especially girls and women, experience sexual violence, and really many lack enough food and even water. Some are coming with smugglers known as coyotes, and these coyotes sometimes kidnap the kids or try to extort money from the family. So the journey's over, and the way the kids are getting here is incredibly dangerous. As attorneys, what we try to do is determine if a child has a basis under the law to seek relief, right? You saw the chart. So if a child is apprehended at the border, they're immediately placed into deportation proceedings. Many of the children are eligible for even more than one form of relief. And by relief, I mean a pathway to a green card or to lawful permanent resident status. The process of doing so is difficult. It's best with a lawyer, and many of the children don't have lawyers. But the fact remains that many children meet the eligibility requirements for more than one form of relief. And so I wanted to just spend just a couple of minutes talking about how people move from, and especially children, from being undocumented to being lawful permanent resident status, and then on a path to citizenship after that. So it is a myth that people can just get in line and wait their turn. That hasn't existed since 1965. As you can see from this pie chart, that the biggest way that people, children or adults, gain lawful permanent resident status is through being sponsored by a family member who has status, either lawful permanent resident status or is a citizen. You know, upwards of almost 85% of people are getting status this way. The problem is that unless you are an immediate relative of a US citizen, the wait times can be years, if not decades. The other ways are through employment, having an employee sponsor, a small diversity lottery, or humanitarian-based relief, which is a lot of the relief that the unaccompanied children are eligible for. And on this chart, I have a list of all of the common forms of immigration relief that children are eligible for. The two that are highlighted are the most common. Many of these children meet the criteria for both asylum and something called special immigrant juvenile status. So let me just for a minute talk about each of those. Special immigrant juvenile status is something that is available to any youth who's under 21 and not married, and who has suffered abuse, neglect, or abandonment at the hands of at least one of their parents, and who can show that it's both not in their best interest to go back to that abusive or abandoning parent, and that it wouldn't be in their best interest to return to their home country, to their country of origin. If a child can show this, that child is likely eligible for special immigrant juvenile status, which would put them on a pathway to lawful permanent resident status. The tricky part in this is that the child needs to be before a family court or a juvenile court and get a judge to make these findings, and then take that order and apply for the special immigrant juvenile status with the Department of Homeland Security. So not an easy thing for a child to do, but many of the children meet the eligibility requirements for special immigrant juvenile status. Many also meet the requirements for asylum. The nature of asylum is a fear of returning to one's home country, based upon a fear that that the person will suffer harm on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. We do not have time today to really go through the ins and outs of asylum, but it is that fear of persecution on account of these things, and the failure of the government in the home country to protect. But children who have been subject to child abuse and don't have the protection of their governments are eligible. Women who have experienced violence are often found eligible. Children who may identify as LGBTQ. So many of the children also have claims for asylum. And if asylum is granted again, it puts them on that path to a green card. So with that, and being cautious of time, I'm going to turn to talking about DACA, which, as I said at the beginning, takes us to sort of the other extreme of thinking about children who are undocumented, because DACA really is for children that have been here, grown up here. So it's really looking at a very different subpopulation of children. So what is DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals? It is a policy that allows certain undocumented immigrants who have entered the country before their 16th birthday, and before June 15th, 2007, to receive a work permit for 2 years, although now may only be 1 year. I'll talk about that in a minute. And for the time they are here, an exemption from deportation. DACA is what is the legal term, or what it is it's really a form of what's called prosecutorial discretion, which is the decision of the government not to remove an undocumented person, not to try to deport them for a period of time, and often what comes along with that deferred action is the ability to work, a work permit. It does not ever put the person on a path to lawful permanent resident status, to the green card, but it does give them permission to be here for whatever period of time the deferred action is granted for. And like I said, it also usually gives the authority to work. What I have up here, and I'm really not going to go into these in any detail, is what makes someone eligible for the DACA program. As you can see, it goes beyond children, but it is younger people. You had to be under 31 years of age as of June 15, 2012. Had to have come here before you were 16. And the biggest is that it has to have also been before June 15, 2007. There also are requirements that you are in school or graduated from high school, obtained a GED, and you can't have any significant criminal infractions. And none of these criteria are waivable, and exceptions cannot be made. Some key dates with DACA, and then I will truly take us up to just a few days ago. So DACA was announced through executive action by President Obama in June of 2012. Little over 5 years later, the Trump administration attempted to rescind DACA. Pretty quickly, there were several federal lawsuits in Maryland, in DC, in California, that led to there being some injunctions, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So those were just a few months later. The injunctions were in effect while the cases were working their way up through our appeals process. Ultimately, in June of 2019, the Supreme Court accepted the case. And in June of 2020, a decision was issued. So I'm going to go through some of this. So first, the injunctions. Essentially, what the injunctions did was only allow people who had DACA to renew. It did not allow anyone to file for the first time, so no new initial DACA requests. And it was a little more nuanced than that, and you can see on the screen, but essentially it allowed for renewals, but not new applications for DACA, even if you met all of the eligibility requirements that I just went through. The issues that were before the Supreme Court, and again, it's a pretty complicated decision that I'm going to just talk about in pretty simple terms, but these were the two big questions that the court the Supreme Court addressed. The first was whether the Department of Homeland Security's decision to wind down the DACA program was even reviewable by a court. And secondly, whether the Department of Homeland Security decision to wind down the DACA program was lawful. What the Supreme Court decided just a few weeks ago was the administrative decision to review DACA. Yes, it was reviewable. And it also said that the rescission, as it was implemented, violated the requirements of the Administrative Procedures Act. And that's because it failed to offer what it called a reasoned analysis. It failed to give sufficient reasons. And it also failed to talk about the fact that so many young people had relied on it, and that was something that the government failed to consider and address when it sought to rescind it. There are over 700,000 DACA recipients in this country today who rely on their work permits to work and to live. That's a significant reliance interest. Many of those recipients have children of their own who need mom and dad to be working. Employers have invested in their employees who may be DACA recipients. Many are in school. And so that's the nature of the reliance interest. But the Supreme Court decision was narrow. It didn't say DACA was legal, and it did not foreclose the possibility of the government rescinding it again. So that takes us to where we are now. I mean, based upon the Supreme Court decision, DACA should be restored to where it was prior to the rescission in 2017, which means that new applicants who meet the eligibility requirement should be able to apply, that renewals should continue to be accepted, and that advanced parole should be made available. Advanced parole means permission to leave the country and come back. That was not permitted during the time that the injunctions were in place and only allowed for renewals. It also allows time, for hopefully Congress to act, but in the meantime, people should be able to apply who for years haven't met the criteria, but haven't been able to. But the latest is, and unfortunately for many people that were quickly trying to gather all of their documents to apply, so on July 28th, just really a few days ago, there was a memo from the acting director of the Department of Homeland Security, scaling back the program. The memo sort of said, while it decided whether to end it. The memo says that while they're trying to decide what to do, they are going to reject initial applications, reject advanced parole applications, except in very exceptional circumstances, and are even, in terms of renewal, only allowing people to renew for 1 year when it had been 2 years. Many advocates, myself included, think that this goes against what the Supreme Court decided, and there are actions going on right now in federal court. I held off even sending this to my presentation to the Alumni Association until just noon today, because I was expecting there to maybe be even more recent news, but the latest as of when I logged on to present was that this memo is still in place, leaving lots of potential DACA recipients sort of in limbo once again. With that, and with it, I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions. I will take questions. Also on this screen is my email address if people wanted to contact me after today. And so I'll now look to Terrence, do we have any questions? And you can certainly type in questions as we talk now. We have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. We do appreciate it. We have a few questions. I want to do my best to get to most of them and try to categorize as best I can. The first question here, if I can get my screen to act correctly, is regarding DACA. First thing is, what are the age limits for DACA?
I'm going to go back and show you the age limits were on this screen. So you had to be under 31 years of age as of June 15, 2012. The biggest one is that you have to have come to this country before you the age of 16, and you have to have continuously lived in this country since June 15, 2007. You also need to be 15 or 16 at least to apply. Does that answer that? I think so.
Yes. Yeah. Next question is, how can I help new DACA applicants? How can faith-based communities best support these children?
So I think that there's lots of ways. I mean, I think if you believe in the DACA program, I think we can let our elected officials know that the real cure and for DACA is for there to be legislation so that it's not an executive action that can be undone by a new administration, as it was here. Making it be law would help a lot. I think right now, we don't know. My hope is that a court is going to say that this July 28th memo is not lawful under the Supreme Court's decision. So there may be a period of time when young people can apply who haven't been able to. So helping those young people, if you know any of them, two big things. I mean, one is to apply for DACA. You have to be able to show this long list. Very hard to show. I don't know if I could, where I've been for the last 13 years and that I've been, in this country is really what you have to show. So my law students and I have been working with several potential DACA applicants to help them, what I call gather their proofs, gather their documents, which is no easy feat right now when we're in a pandemic and a lot of schools and doctors' offices and things are closed. School records, doctors' records, those kinds of things are our best sources of proof. The other thing is it costs money, and many of our potential DACA applicants don't have, each application is $500. So there's also the financial way to help.
Great. Another question. This one's about unaccompanied children. What if the unaccompanied child's potential U.S. caregiver is undocumented themselves?
So that's a great question, and one when I have more time I go into, but let me address it. Because that's a reality. I mean, if you remember the chart, and I talked about how children are placed with sponsors and family members, many of those sponsors are not documented either, just like the children. And that's a real issue, especially with this administration. Prior administrations, there was more of sort of a lack of transfer of information between the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services. So sponsors felt okay to come forward to the Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of Refugee Resettlement and say, yes, I want to take in my niece or nephew or my child or my grandchild, and felt comfortable, there was still some risk, doing so, and which in some ways would then identify themselves and identify the fact that they themselves are not documented. With this administration, there has been an intentional sharing of information between ICE and ORR. And that has made many sponsors who themselves are not documented not want to come forward because they're fearing that coming forward would put themselves in deportation proceedings. This has led to literally thousands more children remaining in ORR facilities instead of being released to sponsors. Many sponsors are still coming forward because they just love their children so much, but some are not. So that is a concern, and much more a concern with this administration than past administrations.
Great. Final question here is, are there mental health services available for migrant children?
There are some, but not enough. Almost all of the children that I interact with that are recently arrived are really in need of mental health services, of therapy to deal with the multiple forms of trauma that they have lived through and are experiencing. The problem is that many of these children don't qualify for any form of public health insurance. They don't. Medicaid is federal. They don't qualify for any federal benefits. They may be able to get some short-term therapy through state funding, but the problem is that they don't have health insurance and don't really have the means to pay for it. On the flip side of it, there also is the issue that there aren't enough providers, and especially providers that are bilingual in English and Spanish. Many of the recently arrived children, English isn't their first language, and they're much, much more comfortable in Spanish or even an indigenous language if they're from Guatemala. So a desperate need for mental health services and increased mental health services.
Okay, I lied. We had one last question.
Sure.
All right, let me just pull it up here. As a child protection supervisor, where should I send youth needing to apply for DACA, who would likely be able to prove abuse or neglect if we are involved?
So there are some legal services offices. I think Child Protective Services, so it's going to depend. My answer is going to depend on whether the child is with family or in foster care. If they're in foster care, Rutgers actually, and I'm involved with this, you said it at the beginning, provides legal representation to any child that it needs an immigration lawyer. But those are for children in foster care. If they're not in foster care, there are some legal services organizations that do provide representation to the children, but not nearly enough. We estimate we're only meeting about 10 to 15% of the need. But you're welcome to contact me and I can try to put you in touch with some of those service providers, but there's a desperate need for more pro bono attorneys for undocumented children in New Jersey.
Great. Professor, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise tonight. I do appreciate it. And thank you to all of the attendees for joining us virtually today. We hope to see you at another event that's presented by the RUAA very soon. Thank you all and have a safe and great evening.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye now.